In the summer of 1987, a demolition crew in rural Kentucky thought they were just tearing down an old farmhouse. But what they uncovered under those rotting floorboards stopped the job cold and changed their lives forever. A hidden box of photographs, stretching back more than a century, revealed a single family's obsession with preserving their pure bloodline. At first glance, the faces seemed normal, until you realized they were the same faces, generation after generation, twisted more and more with each passing decade. And then there was the final photograph, a face that no longer looked human. This is the story of the Blackwood bloodline, a tale of forbidden unions, isolation, and a genetic nightmare that defied nature itself. By the end, you'll question what it truly means to be human, and whether some family secrets should stay buried forever. If you're ready to dive into one of the most disturbing true stories ever uncovered, hit that like button. It really helps more curious minds find this video. Subscribe if you love deep cinematic dives into dark history, and share this with someone who thinks their family is complicated. Trust me, by the end, you won't look at family trees the same way again. The summer heat pressed down on rural Kentucky, the kind that made sweat bead on foreheads before a man even started working. The demolition crew stood outside the leaning farmhouse, their boots sinking into soft earth. The house looked ready to collapse on its own, its roof sagging, windows hollowed out like staring eyes. The crew's foreman, a grizzled man named Cole, spat into the dirt and muttered about getting the job done fast. Inside, the air was sour with mildew and dust, every step causing the warped floorboards to groan. One of the younger workers, Travis, joked that the place felt haunted, though his voice cracked slightly as he said it. The first blow of the sledgehammer sent plaster raining down, revealing old wallpaper patterned with vines, faded almost to nothing. The house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to be uncovered. As the men pried up the warped boards in the front room, a strange smell hit them. Not mold, not rot, but something sweet and metallic, like rust and old blood mixed together in the summer heat. Under the floorboards lay a box, weathered by decades, its wood soft and swollen with moisture. Travis reached for it, but Cole stopped him, wanting to be the one who opened whatever secret the house had kept. The hinges crumbled under his grip, the lid falling away with a splintered crack. Inside were photographs, hundreds of them, stacked and yellowed, each one wrapped in a brittle paper sleeve as if carefully archived by unseen hands. The first few photographs showed ordinary men, stern-faced farmers, their hair cropped short, holding rifles or standing beside freshly built barns. But as the crew flipped through them, the faces began to blur together in strange ways. Each generation looked eerily similar, the same jawlines, the same heavy brows, as though the men in the photos were reflections of one another through time. Travis swore he saw the same man appear in photos decades apart. One photograph stopped everyone cold. It showed a group of 5 men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of the farmhouse they now stood inside. Their expressions were blank, but their features didn't seem quite right. The tallest man's arms appeared too long, his knuckles hanging lower than they should, while another man's head seemed misshapen, with a slope that made his eyes look uneven. Someone cursed under his breath and dropped the photo. As more pictures spilled out, the changes became more dramatic. The final photograph in the box was so unsettling that one of the crew staggered back, refusing to look at it again, muttering that no man should look like that. Cole picked it up and stared. The face staring back was almost human, but not quite. The eyes were far apart, the mouth stretched into something between a grin and a grimace. Its head seemed almost too large for its body. A heavy silence filled the room. Outside, a crow let out a harsh cry, breaking the spell for a moment, but none of the men spoke. The house seemed to grow colder, though the summer air outside was sweltering. Travis finally asked where the photographs had come from. The back of one of the sleeves held a date, 1891, and a single name written in shaky ink, Blackwood. The name meant nothing to them yet. Cole pocketed the photographs despite Travis insisting they leave them behind. Something about the discovery felt like crossing a line, but curiosity was stronger than fear, and the crew carried the box outside to inspect further. The men gathered under the shade of a tree, flipping through the images in tense silence. The sequence of photos told a story without words, a family line that had grown stranger with every passing generation. In the distance, the farmhouse loomed behind them like a watching figure, as though it disapproved of its secrets being revealed. The men felt its presence like a weight on their shoulders, urging them to stop. Cole finally closed the box and told the men to keep working, but no one moved. The discovery had changed the atmosphere. Even the sound of cicadas seemed muted, as though the land itself was listening. When they finally resumed tearing down the house, every creak of wood sounded like a groan of protest. Travis swore he heard faint scratching noises under the remaining floorboards, though nothing was found when they pried them up. By late afternoon, they had stripped most of the house down to its frame, but the sense of being watched never left them. The shadows seemed to stretch too far across the walls, as though something moved just beyond sight. That night, Cole took the box of photographs home with him. He spread them out on his kitchen table under the yellow glow of a single bulb, trying to piece together the faces, arranging them in order by date. The earliest images were almost comforting. Proud mountain men standing in open fields, their expressions severe but human. But by the time he reached the final few, Cole's stomach turned. These weren't just odd-looking men. They were deformed. Some had misshapen skulls that elongated their faces unnaturally. Others had limbs that bent strangely, giving them the appearance of walking on all fours, even while standing upright. The changes were too consistent to be random misfortune. Cole stayed up until dawn staring at those images, unable to shake the feeling that the family had done this to themselves on purpose. The photographs felt less like a record and more like a warning passed down through time. The next morning, he brought the box back to the worksite, intending to hand it over to the sheriff. But before he could, two of his men quit on the spot, saying they wanted nothing more to do with the house. Cole couldn't blame them. The air around the farmhouse felt different now, heavier, as if the land itself had absorbed the pain and madness of the men who had once lived there. That afternoon, while tearing out the last of the floorboards, Travis uncovered another hidden space, a crawl space no more than 2 feet high. The smell that came out of it made every man cover his mouth. Inside were more remnants, broken furniture, bits of animal bones, and something far more disturbing, a crude wooden figure carved in the shape of a man, its head grotesquely oversized, its limbs stretched thin like sticks. Cole pulled the figure out and dropped it in the sunlight. The details were crude but unmistakable. Whoever carved it had seen something monstrous and tried to capture it. Travis refused to touch it, stepping back like it might move. The men finished the job by sundown, but no one cheered when the last wall came down. Instead, they left quickly, each man glancing back at the empty clearing as though expecting something to crawl out of the rubble. Cole locked the box of photographs in the trunk of his truck, but he didn't drive straight home. Instead, he sat on the hood for nearly an hour, staring at the tree line, waiting for the sense of being watched to fade. It never did. Even when he finally started his engine and drove away, he caught sight of something in his rearview mirror, a shape standing in the ruins, too far away to make out clearly, but tall, still, and staring. That night, Cole dreamed of the final photograph. The inhuman face stared back at him, its mouth moving, though no sound came out. When he woke, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were clenched into fists. By morning, he had made up his mind to learn more about the Blackwood name. He couldn't shake the thought that the house had chosen to reveal its secret to them, as though it wanted the story to be told. The next step would take him deep into dusty county records, old census data, and stories passed down by the oldest men in the nearby town. Stories that would make the photographs seem tame by comparison. And so began Cole's descent into the history of the Blackwood family, a journey that would drag him into a past so dark, so twisted, that he would question not just what they were, but whether they had ever been fully human at all. Jeremiah Blackwood arrived in Harlan County with little more than a mule, an axe, and a vision. He wanted a place where no man could tell him how to live or what laws to follow. He chose a stretch of bottomland along a crooked creek, thick with trees and far from the nearest road. Neighbors were scarce, and that suited Jeremiah just fine. Solitude was his closest companion. He built the first cabin by hand, squaring logs and chinking gaps with clay. Each strike of the axe echoed like a claim of ownership, announcing that this land belonged to Blackwood and no one else. When the first neighbors finally crossed his path, they found him lean, hard-eyed, and silent. He spoke little, preferring to let the cold intensity of his stare answer most questions before they were asked. By the time other settlers heard of him, Jeremiah had cleared enough ground for crops and built a smokehouse, a barn, and a fence strong enough to keep out curious wanderers. He liked his world sealed tight. Those who met him wrote in ledgers that he had the look of a man who'd walked too long in lonely country. There was a gravity about him that made others uneasy, though no one dared challenge him. Jeremiah's sons were raised in this isolation, learning to hunt, farm, and fight before they could read. He taught them that a man's blood was his most sacred possession, a legacy not to be diluted by outsiders. Around the fire at night, he told them that Blackwood blood carried strength, sharper minds, stronger backs, a will that bent weaker men. Whether it was true or not, the boys grew up believing every word. When other settlers suggested trade or friendship, Jeremiah refused. He told his sons that the outside world brought weakness, and that men who relied on others soon forgot how to stand on their own. The first hint of trouble came when one of Jeremiah's sons, Elias, began talking of leaving the homestead to find work in town. Jeremiah's temper flared, his voice like a lash, forbidding him from going. The argument ended with Elias storming into the woods, not returning for days. When he finally came back, his face was bruised and his eyes hollow. He never spoke of what happened out there. After that, Jeremiah's rules grew harsher. He demanded that his sons take loyalty oaths before the fire, swearing to keep the family together no matter the cost. To break the oath was to break the bloodline. Travelers passing through the valley wrote of strange chants drifting from the Blackwood homestead on moonless nights, deep voices rising and falling in rhythm like a sermon no outsider was meant to hear. One storekeeper claimed that Jeremiah came into town only once a year, trading hides and grain for salt and tools, never lingering, never smiling. He spoke as though the town itself made his skin crawl. When census men came to record who lived on the land, Jeremiah met them at the gate with a rifle across his chest. He gave them the bare minimum of information, no more, no less. His sons grew into hard young men, broad-shouldered and silent like him. They worked the land side by side, speaking little, their faces set like stone. Outsiders said they looked like copies of their father. By the late 1850s, the Blackwood homestead was thriving, but at a cost. The family's isolation was complete, and the boys had never known another way of life. Their world began and ended at the tree line. Tales spread through the county about strange gatherings at the homestead, of torches burning late into the night and sounds that didn't quite resemble singing. Some said they were prayers. Others whispered they were something darker. Jeremiah dismissed any rumor as foolish talk, but his eyes carried a secret weight, as though he knew something the rest of the valley didn't. Whatever he had planned for his sons, it was nearly complete. The Civil War came and went, but no Blackwood fought in it. They remained on their land, untouched, unmoved, their allegiance sworn only to themselves. Some said it was cowardice. Others said it was defiance. By the war's end, Jeremiah's sons were men grown, each as stubborn and solitary as their father. But there was a problem. There were no other families nearby to marry into, no alliances to forge. Instead of seeking outsiders, Jeremiah gathered his sons and made them vow to keep their bloodline unbroken. He spoke of destiny, of carrying something rare and powerful that must not be weakened by mixing with strangers. The first unions were arranged quietly, in the dark of winter, when no neighbors were likely to come calling. The ceremonies were simple, marked by firelight and the reading of words Jeremiah claimed were older than Scripture. The sons obeyed without question. Whether out of fear, devotion, or belief, they followed their father's design. Soon the first children were born, each carrying more of Jeremiah's blood than any man before them. The county record books noted births but never mentioned mothers. When census men asked questions, Jeremiah gave curt answers and sent them away quickly. What mattered was that the family was growing, its roots twisting deeper. By the 1860s, the Blackwood farm was a closed world unto itself, its men rarely leaving except to hunt or trade. The neighbors began to notice how much the younger generation resembled one another, more than seemed natural. A preacher once tried to visit, hoping to bring the family back into the church. He returned pale, shaken, muttering that he had seen things in that house that no man should ever see. He said the boys moved in eerie unison, standing side by side like soldiers, their faces blank as though waiting for a command only they could hear. After that, no preacher came again. Jeremiah aged but never softened. His beard grew white, his hands knotted with work, yet his eyes stayed sharp. He watched his sons and grandsons like a general surveying troops, ensuring they stayed loyal to the vision. By the 1870s, the Blackwood name had become a warning whispered in the valley. Travelers were told to steer clear of the homestead. Hunters swore the woods near the property went unnaturally silent after sundown. Jeremiah lived long enough to see 3 generations take root, each one more insular than the last. When he finally died, his sons buried him beneath the oak tree he had planted his first year there. No marker was placed on the grave. No prayer was spoken aloud. His sons stood in silence, hats in their hands, until the wind rose through the valley like a voice calling them back to work. With Jeremiah gone, the family turned inward even more. The eldest son took leadership, but his father's vision burned just as fiercely in him. The Blackwoods would keep their bloodline pure, no matter the cost. And so the foundation was laid for what was to come, the choices that would shape the next 100 years. The homestead became less a farm and more a fortress, guarding secrets that no outsider could ever understand. In that quiet valley, the Blackwood legacy hardened into something immovable. What had begun as one man's dream of freedom was now a creed that chained his descendants to the land and to each other. By the late 1870s, the Blackwood farm was no longer just a home, but a sealed kingdom. The men spoke to no one outside the family, their lives guided by rules only they understood. Their gatherings became more frequent, held in the barn long after dark, voices murmuring in low tones. Travelers passing nearby reported seeing lantern light through the cracks, shadows moving in patterns too deliberate to be random. The Blackwood sons and grandsons had grown into nearly identical men, tall, broad-shouldered, and severe. Outsiders said it was like looking at the same face repeating across different ages, an eerie reflection of one bloodline. As they reached adulthood, the younger men were not sent into town for work or trade. Instead, they were given tasks within the homestead, building new outbuildings, tending livestock, and digging fresh cellars beneath the house. These cellars became important in the years to come, places where strangers were never invited. Men who delivered supplies claimed they could hear muffled sounds under the floor, though no one ever admitted what was kept down there. The new unions were not casual choices but planned events, decided by the eldest Blackwood. He kept records in a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with names, dates, and lines connecting sons to cousins. Each pairing was chosen with care, designed to keep the bloodline contained. The young men were raised to see these arrangements as destiny, not preference. Their loyalty was measured by their willingness to obey. As years passed, the family tree grew denser, its branches looping back on themselves. The Blackwoods saw this not as a warning, but as a sign of strength, proof that no outside blood had corrupted them. By 1880, strange physical traits began to appear. Some boys were born with unusually long arms, others with jaws that jutted forward. Neighbors whispered but kept their distance, fearing what might happen if they interfered. The county doctor who dared visit described the children in careful clinical notes, his handwriting shaky. He returned to town pale and silent, refusing to speak of what he had seen except in private journals. He wrote that the boys moved strangely, their joints bending too far, their steps uneven like colts struggling to walk. Some never spoke a word, only making guttural noises when startled or excited. The Blackwoods did not hide these sons from one another, but they kept them out of sight whenever outsiders approached. They were seen as proof of the family's chosen path, consequences accepted as part of their creed. As the years went on, birth defects grew more severe. The ledger recorded stillbirths and infant deaths, though the entries were marked with symbols instead of words, as though the very idea of failure was too dangerous to write. Despite the losses, the family never wavered. The eldest Blackwood preached that these were tests, trials meant to purify the line. His sons listened solemnly, nodding as though the deaths were sacred offerings to some higher plan. By the mid-1880s, the farm no longer felt like part of the county. Visitors spoke of a silence that settled over the place, a heavy stillness that made birds stop singing, and dogs refused to cross the fence line. Hunters who strayed too close reported hearing chanting at night, the voices of men rising and falling in a rhythm that made their skin crawl. Some claimed to see shapes moving between the trees, watching silently. The younger generation, now grown, took on the same haunted look as their fathers. Their eyes seemed too old for their faces, as though they had seen things no boy should see. A neighbor once described meeting one of them on the road. The young man stared at him without blinking, then smiled too wide, showing teeth filed to sharp points. The neighbor never returned to that road again. Despite growing fear in the community, no one dared confront the Blackwoods directly. The family's reputation for violence was enough to keep the sheriff at a distance, though even he admitted hearing cries from the property some nights. One stormy night, a traveling preacher took shelter in the barn. The next morning he was gone, leaving behind only his boots and a torn Bible. The family claimed he left before dawn, but no one saw him leave. Rumors grew that the Blackwoods had turned to something darker than isolation, some form of devotion that required blood. The townsmen spoke of them in hushed tones, as though saying the name too loud might summon them. Inside the homestead, life became more ritualized. Meals were taken in silence, every movement deliberate. The ledger was updated weekly, and the eldest Blackwood kept it locked in a chest as though it were scripture. Some nights, smoke curled from the chimney carrying a strange, bitter smell. Neighbors said it was the smell of animals being burned, though no one could explain why there were no bones in the ash pit afterward. As the family withdrew deeper into secrecy, the house itself began to change. Windows were boarded from the inside, doors reinforced, and the second floor was converted into rooms that no visitor was ever allowed to see. Traders reported hearing multiple voices whispering when they stood at the front gate, though only one man ever came out to meet them. Sometimes they swore they saw movement behind the windows, figures watching in total silence. The next generation of children was born during this period of total isolation. These sons bore even stronger resemblances to one another, their features collapsing into near-perfect copies, as though nature itself had run out of new designs. Some were born too frail to survive, others with growths along their skulls or twisted spines. Yet every loss seemed to make the family more resolute, as though tragedy was the price of perfecting their vision. By the turn of the century, the Blackwood name had become legend, spoken of only by the oldest men in the valley. They said the family had turned itself into something apart, something no longer entirely human. Young men from neighboring farms dared each other to approach the property line at night, but none crossed it. Those who lingered swore they heard breathing just beyond the tree line, deep and animal-like. The family's control was absolute now. Every son was accounted for. Every union planned years in advance. The ledger was said to contain the future itself, mapping who would be paired with whom for generations ahead. The farm became a place of pilgrimage for the Blackwoods themselves. Sons who had left returned eventually, drawn back by duty or fear. No man truly escaped. Once born into the bloodline, you were bound to it forever. As the century turned, so did the final lock on the Blackwood world. Outsiders no longer mattered. The family's gaze turned inward completely, and the twisted web of their own making tightened around them with unrelenting grip. It was in this darkness that the next chapter would begin, a period when the family's children would grow stranger, the sounds from the house more haunting, and the neighbors' fear would turn into quiet dread. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Blackwood farm no longer resembled the working homestead it had once been. The fields lay fallow, the barns were empty, but smoke still curled from the chimney at dusk. Neighbors whispered that the Blackwoods had turned their home into something else entirely. No one saw them in town anymore, and the rare sound of a wagon on the road vanished altogether. Inside the farmhouse, the second floor had been transformed into a series of locked rooms. The youngest sons were kept there, rarely allowed outside, their existence known only through the sounds that drifted through the floorboards. At night, strange thumps echoed through the rafters, the shuffle of hands and knees on wood, the scrape of nails against walls. Visitors said it sounded like animals trapped in a too-small cage. The surviving doctor who occasionally visited wrote that some of the boys had limbs so long they could not stand upright, their joints twisted at angles nature never intended. He described their voices as low, discordant growls. When neighbors passed near the property, they claimed to hear more than one sound at once. Heavy breathing, soft muttering, sometimes laughter that stopped suddenly as if the source realized it had been overheard. The eldest Blackwood at the time no longer received visitors in the main room but met them on the porch, speaking through the cracked door, his face barely visible in the shadowed interior. Deliveries were left at the gate, never carried inside by outsiders. Those who lingered too long said they caught glimpses of pale faces staring down from the second-floor windows before disappearing behind curtains nailed shut. Hunters reported seeing figures moving across the roof at night, silhouettes crawling on all fours, their arms bent in ways that made the watchers' stomachs turn. None dared investigate, fearing what they might find. One trapper swore he saw a face pressed to the glass one evening, its features stretched as though pulled too tight across the skull, its mouth hanging open wider than a man's should. Inside, life grew stranger still. Meals were carried upstairs on trays and retrieved hours later with nothing but scraps left. The boys upstairs rarely spoke, but sometimes they sang, deep droning notes that shook the house. Those songs unnerved even the elder Blackwoods, but no one stopped them. Some claimed the chanting brought luck. Others believed it kept something worse from happening. Either way, the practice continued for decades. On stormy nights, neighbors saw lights flickering in the attic windows, faint and yellow. Some swore they heard chanting mixed with the howl of the wind, though others said it was only thunder playing tricks. Visitors described a smell that hung over the property, a mix of damp wood, smoke, and something metallic. It clung to their clothes for days after they left, a reminder they could not wash away. The county sheriff once rode out to investigate after reports of screaming near the creek. He returned pale, refusing to speak of what he saw, except to say the Blackwoods were handling things in their own way. After that, the law stayed away. The farm became its own sovereign ground, a place where rules no longer applied. Outsiders kept clear, passing down warnings to their sons never to cross the fence line. By the 1920s, the upstairs rooms were more crowded than ever. Sons and grandsons lived together in the dim light, their bodies growing stranger with each generation. Some never came downstairs at all, living their entire lives above. When one of them died, the family buried him at night under the oak tree without ceremony. Neighbors sometimes saw the torchlight from their porches and heard the low rumble of voices reciting words in unison. Those who claimed to have seen the body before burial said it barely resembled a man anymore. The limbs were too long, the spine bent, the face caught in a permanent expression somewhere between laughter and a scream. The house itself seemed to respond to its inhabitants. Floorboards warped and sagged, doorways were widened to allow passage, and windows were boarded shut until almost no natural light entered the second story at all. Visitors reported a constant low hum in the air, like distant bees or a voice too low to hear clearly. It vibrated through the walls and into the chest, leaving them nauseated and lightheaded. The Blackwoods spoke less to outsiders with each passing year, their words clipped, their eyes dark with something that was not quite hostility but not quite fear either. It was as if they carried a secret too heavy to share. Some of the younger men were seen outside only at night, moving silently across the fields. Neighbors claimed they could run on all fours faster than a man could sprint upright, vanishing into the tree line without sound. Travelers who camped too close to the property sometimes woke to find strange footprints around their fire. Handprints and footprints mixed together, pressed deep into the mud as though something had circled them while they slept. The town learned to ignore the Blackwoods entirely, pretending they did not exist. This suited the family, who withdrew completely from any contact. Their focus now turned entirely inward, deeper into their rituals and their locked rooms. As the decades passed, the deformities became more severe. Some boys were born without hair, their skulls smooth and elongated. Others had fingers fused together, making their hands look like claws. None were ever sent away. Instead, the upstairs rooms became shrines to these sons, the family caring for them with a reverence outsiders would not understand. They were seen as chosen, proof of the Blackwoods' commitment to keeping the bloodline undiluted. The doctor eventually stopped coming altogether. His last journal entry described the house as a place where man has defied nature for so long that nature has begun to fight back. He never returned. The house grew quieter after that, but the quiet was not peace. It was the silence of a place waiting for something to happen, a tension that made every creak of wood sound like a warning. Sometimes travelers saw shapes in the upstairs windows long after midnight. They said the figures were too tall for the frames, their heads tilted as if their necks could not support their weight. When the Great Depression hit, it barely touched the Blackwoods. They were already self-sufficient, already separate. To them, the outside world had been collapsing for years, and they had no reason to step beyond the gate. By the 1940s, most of the men in the nearby valley had either moved away or stopped speaking of the Blackwoods entirely. The farm was left to its own devices, a dark island of secrecy and survival. It was during this time that hunters began reporting the most disturbing sightings yet. Creatures that looked almost human, moving through the woods on all fours, their pale skin catching moonlight before they vanished into the dark. Some hunters swore the creatures made sounds, not animal calls but words, though twisted and garbled, as though human speech had been broken apart and put back together by something that had never heard language before. The legend of the Blackwood upstairs rooms became a story fathers told their sons to keep them from wandering too far. But even as a story, it carried weight, for everyone knew it was rooted in truth. As the century turned again, the house remained standing, its windows dark, its walls sagging but unbroken. Whatever lived upstairs had become a permanent part of the place, as inseparable from it as its foundation stones. And so the Blackwoods endured, their secrets held tight, their sons locked away in rooms no outsider would ever see. Whatever they had become it together, behind boarded windows and nailed doors. The stage was set for the final generation, for the last son who would carry the family's twisted legacy into a new era, a living testament to what happens when a bloodline turns entirely inward. By the early 1980s, the Blackwood farmhouse was little more than a skeleton, its roof sagging, its porch leaning forward like a warning. Yet faint smoke still rose from the chimney, signaling someone remained inside. The county finally took notice after reports of strange sounds near the property, voices at night, and shadows moving behind the rotting curtains. Social workers were sent, though most turned back before reaching the door. One caseworker, a young man fresh to the job, pushed through the overgrown path and knocked. The door opened a few inches, revealing an interior cloaked in darkness and the smell of damp wood. Inside, 3 men stood. Their clothes were rags, their hair long and tangled, their faces gaunt. They said nothing, staring at the visitor with blank expressions, until he stammered a request to speak with whoever was in charge. From the back of the room came a low, rasping sound, halfway between speech and growl. The eldest of the men gestured toward the staircase, his arm trembling as though the effort of moving it was too much. The caseworker climbed the stairs, each step creaking under his weight. At the top, he smelled something metallic and sour, a mix of rust, earth, and something unmistakably alive. The door at the end stood half open. When he stepped inside, the light from his flashlight caught the figure crouched in the corner. At first, he thought it was an animal. Its limbs were too long, its back curved unnaturally. Then it turned toward him, and he saw its face. The skull was elongated, the eyes too far apart, the jaw wide and thin, as though it had been stretched by invisible hands. The caseworker stumbled back, nearly falling down the stairs. The thing, the last son, did not move from its corner. It simply stared, its chest heaving in uneven, animal-like breaths. Later reports would call him Subject B to protect what little privacy the family still had. But among the men who saw him that day, no one forgot the face staring back from the shadows. Subject B was removed from the house under guard, loaded into a state vehicle while the remaining 2 men stood silently on the porch. They did not resist, but their eyes were full of something like grief. At the hospital, doctors swarmed to examine him. His limbs were twice as long as his torso should allow, his spine curved so sharply that he could not stand without pain. Yet he made no sound. When they tried to draw blood, he finally spoke, or something close to it. The sound came from deep in his chest, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking the same word at slightly different times. The nurses described the sound as wrong, not just unsettling, but physically painful to hear, as though the vibrations struck some part of the brain that wasn't meant to register such noise. X-rays showed bones that had fused in strange places, joints that seemed to have grown backward. Some ribs overlapped others. His skull had formed ridges along the sides as though trying to grow protective armor. Yet what stunned the doctors most was his awareness. He watched them carefully, following their movements with sharp intelligence. When shown simple objects, he understood their use, though his own hands struggled to hold them. Late at night, the orderlies claimed they heard him speaking, not to them, but to himself. Multiple voices echoed in the room, some deeper, some almost childlike, as though many minds were trapped in the same body. When given paper and crayons, he began to draw. The images were not random scribbles, but precise diagrams. Spiraling family trees where the same figure appeared over and over, connected to itself by looping lines. At the center of every drawing was a face, distorted, merging features of many generations, a culmination of the bloodline staring back at whoever dared look long enough. One doctor who examined the drawings said it felt like staring into something both ancient and new, a blueprint for a form of man that was never meant to exist, but had been forced into being. Genetic tests confirmed what many suspected. Generations of deliberate inbreeding had twisted the Blackwood DNA until it no longer resembled the typical human map. But there was something else, something no one could explain. Hidden among the twisted genes were markers that did not match known human ancestry, as though something dormant had been awakened. Old instructions in the code of life brought to the surface by relentless repetition. Some of the doctors argued they had discovered a new branch of evolution, one that should have never been allowed to grow. Others wanted him moved to a secure facility, calling him a danger to himself and others. In the end, Subject B remained under observation for years. He rarely interacted with anyone, but when he did, he seemed to prefer certain men, staring into their faces with unblinking intensity, almost as if recognizing something. When shown photographs of ordinary men, he turned away, covering his head with his long arms. But when shown images of men with deformities, he became calm, almost peaceful, as though seeing something familiar. The orderlies grew superstitious about him, claiming the temperature dropped whenever he was agitated and that equipment in the room malfunctioned without reason. Some refused to work the night shift anywhere near his ward. One night, a guard swore he heard a second voice answering Subject B, though no one else was in the room. The conversation went on for several minutes before ending in a sound like a growl and a laugh combined. As years passed, his health declined. His bones grew brittle, his breathing shallow. Doctors predicted he would not live long, but he endured far beyond their expectations, as though clinging to life by sheer will. When he finally died in the winter of 1993, the room grew unnaturally still. The nurses present said it felt like something had left not just the body, but the entire building. The state buried him quietly in an unmarked grave. No ceremony, no visitors. The last living Blackwood was gone, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any sound. But those who worked with him were never the same. Some left their jobs entirely, saying they felt watched at night, hearing whispers in the dark that echoed the layered voice they had once heard from his chest. The farmhouse was condemned and scheduled for demolition, but the crew that arrived left after half a day. They said they felt hands pressing against the walls from the inside, though no one was there. Subject B was gone, but the legend of the Blackwoods had only grown. Men whispered that something of him still lingered, not just in memory, but in the soil of the valley and the bones of the house. And though the bloodline had ended, the story was far from over. The house remained, its windows dark, waiting for the next man foolish or brave enough to step across the threshold and face what remained inside. The Blackwood farmhouse still stands, its roof sagging like a spine bent with age, its windows black pits staring at the road. No man has lived there long enough to call it home. The county tried selling the property many times. Each new owner lasted only months before packing his belongings and leaving without explanation. Some left in daylight, others fled at night, abandoning everything behind them. Neighbors say they see lanterns moving inside even when the house is empty. Lights glide from room to room, pausing in the upstairs windows before fading as though swallowed by the walls themselves. Those brave enough to step inside report the air feels thick, almost liquid, as though the house itself is breathing. Each step on the floorboard seems louder than it should, echoing through the empty halls. Men who stayed overnight claimed they heard voices speaking in unison, deep and low, coming from the upper rooms. The words are never clear, more like a language built from growls and distant thunder. One sheriff investigating trespassers swore he heard something crawling through the walls, nails scratching wood. He left before dawn, refusing to enter the house again, saying he felt something watching him from the ceiling above. Visitors often find objects that shouldn't be there, carved wooden figures lying in dust, some barely human in shape. Each one shows elongated limbs, wide jaws, and heads too large for the bodies. A hunter claimed he found a figure with his own initials scratched into its back, though he had never been there before. He burned it that night, but swore he heard whispers in the flames. The basement is worse. Men who dared to go down said the temperature dropped instantly. Moisture dripped from the beams, and faint handprints appeared in the dust on the floor, though no one had touched it. One man swore he heard heavy breathing right behind him, though he was alone. When he turned, he saw impressions forming in the dirt, as though invisible feet were slowly walking toward him. The house seems to shift subtly from visit to visit. Doorways are wider, hallways longer, as if the place is slowly reshaping itself to match the bodies that once lived within its walls. Some believe the house is alive now, its wood and stone soaked with generations of Blackwood blood, holding the memory of every ritual, every cry, every sound that was ever made inside. Locals avoid the road that passes near the property. They say at night the sound of footsteps follows anyone who walks too close, always staying just far enough behind to never be seen. On windy nights, multiple voices can be heard calling from the upstairs windows. The calls are not words, but something older, a chorus that raises the hair on a man's neck. The land around the house is just as strange. Animals refuse to graze near the fence line, and hunters say deer trails curve wide around the clearing as though guided by instinct to avoid it. Old men in town tell their sons never to step foot on the property, warning that once you hear the voices, they never stop. Some claim to still hear them decades after leaving. A demolition crew tried once more to tear the house down, but their equipment failed. Engines stalled, saws broke teeth on soft wood, and one man broke his arm when a beam fell without warning. They left before sunset, refusing to return. The house remained untouched, standing defiant against time, as though some unseen force refused to let it be destroyed, holding the final chapter of the Blackwood legacy together. Some believe the last son still lingers there, not in flesh, but in something deeper. A presence that watches from the dark corners, waiting for another Blackwood to return and complete the circle. Those who dream of the house report the same image. A figure crouched in the upstairs hallway, arms too long, head tilted. It smiles without sound until the dreamer wakes drenched in sweat. Paranormal investigators have tried to capture evidence. Their recordings come back warped, full of overlapping voices, some speaking words in unison, others whispering in a tongue that has no translation. One recording caught a single phrase that could be understood: "Still here." After that, the investigator refused to listen to the tapes again, claiming he heard breathing in his own house at night. The house is now considered cursed ground. No man who has stayed overnight has lasted more than 3 weeks before leaving with hollow eyes and shaking hands, refusing to say what they saw. Even the bravest men avoid the upstairs entirely. Those who have entered claim the air feels heavier there, as though every breath is shared with something standing just out of sight. Footsteps are often heard on the ceiling when no one is above. Sometimes they are slow and deliberate, other times frantic, as if something is running on all fours across the rafters. Objects move between visits. Furniture is found in new places. Doors that were closed stand open, and carvings appear in the walls overnight, etched deep with symbols no one recognizes. Some men have seen handprints appear on the inside of the windows, as if pressed by something trying to get out. The prints stay for days, slowly fading like mist. The house seems to remember every visitor, offering each man a different experience. Some hear voices, others see figures, but all leave with the same feeling: that something followed them home. Dreams become common after visiting. Men dream of standing in the clearing, hearing voices from the tree line calling their names, pulling them back to the house night after night. Those who return to confront the place often come back changed, speaking less, staring into space as though listening to something others cannot hear. A few disappear entirely, their trucks found abandoned by the gate. Local authorities have stopped answering calls about the property. They tell complainants to leave it alone, saying some places are better forgotten, some bloodlines better left to rot in the soil where they began. Still, on quiet nights, the lights appear in the windows. Shadows move behind the curtains, shapes too tall and thin to be men, their silhouettes lingering long enough to make witnesses turn and run. The house endures, a monument to choices made generations ago. Its walls hold the memory of every birth, every death, every twisted moment of devotion that turned men into something unrecognizable. Some say it will stand until the last of its story is told, until someone brave enough dares to stay, listen to the voices, and write the final words in the Blackwood ledger. Until then, the house waits. It breathes. And when the wind moves through the valley, the voices rise again. A warning, a call, and perhaps an invitation for any man foolish enough to answer.